Long before the age of gunpowder and espionage agencies, before poison rings and encrypted messages, there existed a profession so dangerous, so physically brutal, and so morally treacherous that those who entered it rarely lived to grow old. They were the assassins of the medieval world, men and occasionally women who were hired, commanded, or compelled to end the lives of kings, lords, bishops, and rivals. The word itself, assassin, carries centuries of weight and blood. It conjures images of shadows slipping through candlelit corridors, blades drawn, hearts steady. But the reality was far removed from this romantic silhouette. Being a medieval assassin was, in almost every conceivable way, a miserable and extremely dangerous occupation. The odds were stacked against the killer from the very beginning, and they only grew worse with every passing day. To understand why, we must first understand the world in which these killers operated. Medieval Europe and the broader medieval world, stretching from the British Isles to the Byzantine Empire, from Scandinavia to the Levant, was a society built upon rigid hierarchies of power, loyalty, and divine authority. Kings ruled by what was understood to be the grace of God. Lords commanded armies. The Church wielded spiritual authority over the living and the dead alike. To kill a man of power in this world was not merely a criminal act. It was an assault on the divine order itself, a rupture in the fabric of the cosmos as medieval people understood it. An assassin, therefore, was not simply a murderer. He was a transgressor against heaven and earth simultaneously. And the punishments he faced, if caught, reflected that dual transgression with terrifying thoroughness. Let us begin with the most fundamental problem facing any medieval assassin: getting close enough to the target. In modern fiction, the assassin is a ghost, invisible and untouchable, drifting through locked rooms and past armed guards as though the laws of physics do not apply. In reality, the medieval world was extraordinarily difficult to move through undetected. Travel itself was a challenge. Roads were poor, often no more than rutted dirt tracks that turned to mud in the rain and froze solid in winter. Strangers moving through the countryside were immediately suspicious. Villages were small and insular communities where every face was known. If you did not belong, people noticed. If you were carrying weapons openly, you invited challenge. If you concealed them, you risked being searched at any gate, toll point, or bridge. The great castles and fortified residences of the medieval nobility were not simply impressive architecture. They were security systems of extraordinary sophistication. A castle like the Tower of London, Windsor Castle, or Château Gallard in Normandy was designed from the ground up to make unauthorized entry as difficult as possible. Multiple layers of walls, controlled entry points, inner gates that could be sealed independently, drawbridges that could be raised, portcullises that could be dropped in seconds. All of these elements worked together to create a layered defense that was very nearly impenetrable to a lone individual acting without inside assistance. Even the layout of the interior of a castle worked against the would-be assassin. Great halls were open spaces where strangers stood out immediately. Private quarters were guarded. Bedchambers were reached only through a succession of antechambers, each occupied by attendants, servants, or guards. Beyond the physical architecture, there was the human architecture of medieval court life. Great lords and kings did not move through the world alone. They were surrounded at all times by a household. A staff of servants, knights, attendants, chamberlains, stewards, and bodyguards whose entire professional purpose was to serve and, when necessary, protect their lord. These men knew each other. They knew their lord's routine, his preferences, his guests, his enemies. A stranger appearing in this environment without explanation would be questioned immediately. The medieval court was simultaneously the most public and the most exclusive space imaginable. Full of people, yet accessible only to those with legitimate reason to be there. For the assassin who wished to penetrate this world, there were essentially two paths. The first was disguise and infiltration, entering the target's environment in a false identity as a servant, a merchant, a pilgrim, or a visiting dignitary. The second was corruption, finding someone already inside the household and turning them to the assassin's purpose. Both paths were extraordinarily dangerous, for reasons that will become clear as we examine them in turn. Disguise and infiltration sound straightforward enough in theory. Dress as a monk, gain access to a religious ceremony attended by the target, and strike. Dress as a merchant, deliver goods to the castle kitchens, find the right moment. In practice, however, medieval society was ferociously hostile to deception of this kind. Every social identity in the medieval world came with a network of verification. A merchant did not simply claim to be a merchant. He had a guild affiliation, a home city, known associates, letters of introduction, a recognizable dialect. A monk belonged to a specific house and could be questioned about his abbot, his brethren, the layout of his cloister. A traveling knight had a coat of arms that experts could read like a text, identifying his family, his lord, his region of origin. To convincingly assume any of these identities required not just the right clothing but a complete biographical fabrication supported by documentary evidence and personal knowledge that would withstand scrutiny. The few historical cases we know of where assassins successfully used disguise reveal just how elaborate the preparation had to be. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered in his own cathedral in 1170 by 4 knights who made no attempt at disguise whatsoever. They simply rode up to Canterbury in broad daylight, demanded an audience, argued with Becket, and then killed him in the sanctuary of the church itself. This was not stealth. It was brazen, calculated violence by men who believed their connection to King Henry II would protect them from the consequences. They were wrong about that. As it turned out, the murder triggered an international crisis that forced Henry to do public penance and humiliate himself before the Pope, but the point is instructive. Even those with political backing found the aftermath of political murder to be catastrophic and uncontrollable. No discussion of medieval assassination would be complete without confronting the legend, and the reality, of the Nizari Ismaili sect that European crusaders encountered in the mountains of Syria and Persia, and whom they called the assassins. The very word we use for hired killers comes from the Arabic term hashishiyin, meaning users of hashish, a name that their enemies used to mock and denigrate them. The Nizari Ismailis were a Shia Muslim sect who, following a series of political defeats in the late 11th century, retreated to remote mountain fortresses throughout Persia and Syria. Their leader, Hassan I Sabah, recognized that a small, isolated community could not fight the Sunni Seljuk Turks or the Crusader kingdoms by conventional military means. And so he developed an alternative strategy, targeted political assassination. The men who carried out these missions were called fidai, meaning devotees, or those who sacrificed themselves. They were, by any historical measure, some of the most disciplined and dedicated killers in medieval history. And their lives were, without question, extraordinarily hard. Young men were recruited into the sect, often from an early age, and subjected to years of intensive training, in languages, in the customs and behaviors of foreign courts, in weaponry, in patience, in endurance. The training was comprehensive precisely because the missions demanded comprehensive preparation. A fidai sent to kill a Seljuk vizier in Baghdad might spend years living in that city under an assumed identity, building the trust and access necessary to get close enough to strike. Years. Not days or weeks. Years of living a lie, constantly under threat of exposure, never able to relax, never able to confide in anyone. The weapon of choice for the fidai was the dagger, and this choice was not accidental. It was, in a dark and pragmatic way, the most reliable weapon for close-quarters assassination, more reliable than poison, which could fail or be detected, more reliable than a crossbow, which required clear sight lines and could malfunction, more reliable than a sword, which was large and difficult to conceal. The dagger was small, easily hidden, and absolutely lethal at close range. But using it meant getting within arm's reach of the target, often in a public place surrounded by guards. It meant accepting, as a near certainty, that you would not escape. The fidai were not suicide attackers in the modern sense, they did not seek death, but they operated in the full knowledge that capture and execution were extremely likely outcomes. They trained themselves to accept this possibility with equanimity. Whether the hashish that gave them their European nickname played any actual role in this psychological preparation is debated by historians. Most modern scholars believe the drug connection was largely a fabrication by their enemies, but the psychological conditioning they underwent was real and was formidable. The fidai who carried out successful assassinations almost always died immediately afterward. When the Nizari Ismailis killed Nizam al-Mulk, the great Seljuk vizier, in 1092, the killer posed as a Sufi mystic seeking an audience with the powerful minister. He waited patiently, gained his access, and struck. He was immediately killed. When they attempted to assassinate Saladin, and they attempted it multiple times, the operatives who came closest all died in the attempt or shortly afterward. The one time an assassin actually reached Saladin's bedside in his tent, the killer was caught and executed. Saladin, deeply shaken by how close death had come, ordered his camp surrounded with a ditch and new security protocols that would have done credit to a modern security detail. The assassin's death accomplished nothing except to make the target more difficult to reach. Let us turn now to what happened when an assassination succeeded, because the aftermath of a successful political killing was almost invariably catastrophic for the killer and everyone connected to him. The medieval justice system had no concept of what we might today call proportionate response. When a great lord was murdered, the social obligation of his family, allies, and subjects to avenge that murder was absolute. Not symbolic. Absolute. The blood feud. The institutionalized obligation to visit violence upon the killer and his kin was one of the oldest and most powerful forces in medieval society, predating Christianity itself and persisting long after the Church officially condemned it. To kill a lord was to make an enemy of everyone who owed that lord loyalty, allegiance, or love. And in the tightly interwoven world of medieval aristocracy, that could mean a very large number of very dangerous people. The assassin who succeeded in killing his target had, by that very act of success, guaranteed that he would be hunted. Not casually, not bureaucratically, but with the full force of personal vengeance by men who had the resources, the motivation, and the social obligation to find him and destroy him and, very possibly, his family as well. Nor was the situation any better for assassins who operated under the authority of a lord or king. Medieval rulers who used assassination as a political tool, and many did, had very strong reasons to deny any knowledge of or connection to the killing. If the assassination became politically inconvenient, if it provoked the wrong kind of reaction from the church or from rival powers, the easiest and most effective way for the patron to distance himself from the act was to sacrifice the instrument. The hired killer, the loyal servant who had done what he was told, would find himself suddenly without protection, abandoned to face the consequences alone. This was not an occasional occurrence. It was a structural feature of the political assassination system. The assassin was always, at some level, disposable. Consider the case of the 4 knights who killed Thomas Becket. Sir William de Tracy, Sir Reginald Fitzurse, Sir Hugh de Morville, and Sir Richard Le Breton rode to Canterbury believing, or at least hoping, that they were acting in accordance with their king's wishes. Henry II had famously raged, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And that royal backing would shield them. Instead, the murder provoked international outrage. Pope Alexander III threatened to place England under interdict, essentially to shut down all religious services in the entire kingdom, denying the English people access to the sacraments. Henry, terrified of both spiritual and political consequences, was forced to perform public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury and allowing himself to be flogged by monks at Becket's tomb. As for the 4 knights, they were excommunicated, stripped of their lands, and condemned by the Church. Some accounts suggest they were sent on a permanent crusade to the Holy Land as penance, and that they died there without honor. They had done what their king, in a moment of rage, had asked, and were punished for it, while the king escaped with humiliation rather than ruin. If the political abandonment of the assassin was one horror, the physical reality of what happened to those who were caught was another altogether. Medieval judicial torture and execution were not simply punishments. They were public performances with specific political, religious, and social purposes. When a would-be regicide or political murderer was captured, the authorities did not simply want to punish him. They wanted to extract information: who had ordered the killing, who had helped, who else was part of the conspiracy. They wanted to make an example so vivid, so terrifying, that anyone contemplating similar acts would be deterred. And they wanted to assert the full power of the state or the lord over those who had dared to challenge it. The methods available to medieval interrogators were extensive and had been refined over centuries. Strappado, being suspended by the wrists bound behind the back, then dropped, could dislocate both shoulders without leaving visible marks, causing agonizing pain while leaving the subject capable of speaking. The rack could stretch the body until joints separated. Hot irons could burn specific parts of the body with controlled precision. Thumbscrews could be applied gradually, ratcheted tighter hour by hour. Waterboarding-like techniques involving wet cloths and forced hydration were known and used. The specific details vary by time and place, but the fundamental principle was consistent. Interrogators had access to a comprehensive toolkit for generating pain and compliance, and they used it methodically and systematically on anyone suspected of serious political crimes. Execution, when it came, was calibrated to the severity of the crime. For ordinary murderers, hanging was the standard fate in much of medieval Europe: painful, humiliating, and public, but relatively swift. For those convicted of high treason, and killing a king or great lord was the highest form of treason, the punishments were vastly more elaborate. In England, the punishment for treason was hanging, drawing, and quartering. The condemned was hanged but cut down while still conscious, then emasculated, then disemboweled and forced to watch his own entrails burned before his eyes, then beheaded, and finally cut into 4 pieces, the head and quarters to be displayed on spikes at prominent locations throughout the kingdom as a warning to others. This was not a procedure designed for the dignity of the condemned. It was designed to be maximally horrifying and maximally public. The body of the traitor was not simply killed. It was systematically unmade, piece by piece, in front of a crowd. In France, Germany, and much of continental Europe, the wheel was a common instrument of execution for particularly serious crimes. The condemned was spread-eagled on a large wheel and his bones were broken one by one with a heavy hammer, legs first, then arms, then the torso, until death eventually came, sometimes after many hours. In some jurisdictions the executioner was authorized to deliver a mercy blow to the chest or head to hasten the end, but this was a discretionary concession that could be withheld. Burning alive at the stake was reserved primarily for heretics, but political murderers who were also found guilty of heresy, not a difficult charge to manufacture in a theocratic legal system, could face this fate as well. In Byzantium, blinding and castration were common punishments for would-be assassins and conspirators, reflecting a Byzantine legal tradition that preferred to disable enemies rather than simply kill them, though the blinding was typically performed with hot irons and was itself an agonizing procedure. If the blade was dangerous and the bowman risky, medieval assassins who turned to poison faced an entirely different set of problems, no less lethal to their prospects of success, and in some ways more insidious. Poison carried enormous cultural weight in the medieval world. It was considered a peculiarly cowardly and dishonorable method of killing. A woman's weapon, a traitor's tool, something that struck from concealment rather than confronting the enemy face to face. This cultural prejudice made accusations of poisoning extremely volatile. To accuse a person of poisoning was to accuse them not just of murder but of a specific kind of moral corruption. Conversely, to be suspected of attempting poisoning was to be suspected not just of murderous intent but of comprehensive treachery and depravity. Medieval understanding of poisons was extensive but imprecise. A significant body of knowledge about toxic plants, minerals, and animal substances had accumulated over centuries, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman sources, Arabic medical traditions, and practical folk knowledge. Nightshade, hemlock, arsenic, lead compounds, and dozens of herbal preparations were known to be lethal in sufficient quantities. The problem for the aspiring poisoner was that medieval medicine, while it lacked modern toxicology, was not entirely without defenses. Physicians, particularly at wealthy courts, were alert to the possibility of poisoning. Elaborate rituals had developed around the service of food and drink to great lords, tasting by a trusted servant before the lord consumed anything, serving in special cups that were believed, often incorrectly, to have the property of changing color in the presence of poison. Careful attention to the chain of custody of all food and drink from kitchen to table. The preparation and administration of poison also required access to the target's food or drink over a sustained period, which brought the poisoner back to the same problem as the assassin with a dagger, the need to penetrate the inner circle. If you could not get close enough to poison someone, you needed an inside agent to do it for you. And inside agents were extraordinarily dangerous to use. They knew who you were. They had evidence of your intentions. If they were caught or turned informer, you were exposed. If they succeeded in the poisoning and were then themselves caught, the investigation would lead inevitably back to whoever had supplied them with the poison and given the instruction. The chain of evidence in a poisoning case was shorter and more personal than in most crimes. There is also the matter of reliability. Medieval poisons were not pharmaceutical-grade compounds with predictable dosages and reliably lethal concentrations. They were natural substances whose potency varied enormously depending on preparation, the condition of the raw material, and the physiology of the target. Arsenic, for example, one of the most commonly used poisons throughout the medieval period, favored because it was tasteless, odorless, and produced symptoms that could be mistaken for natural illness, was genuinely lethal but required careful dosing. Too little and the target merely became ill, too much and the symptoms became so dramatic and so rapid that natural causes became implausible. The poisoner who miscalculated might find that his target survived and was now intensely suspicious, or that the method of death was so obviously unnatural that an investigation was immediately launched. For the medieval assassin, the physical dangers were matched and in some ways exceeded by the spiritual ones. Medieval Christendom was a world in which the fate of the soul after death was understood to be a matter of absolute, unquestionable reality. Heaven and hell were not metaphors. They were places, real destinations toward which every human soul was inevitably traveling. The Church held the keys to salvation. The sacraments, confession, absolution, the final rites of extreme unction, were not merely symbolic gestures. They were understood to be the mechanisms by which the soul was prepared for the journey to God. A person who died without these sacraments was in grave spiritual peril. A person who died in a state of unconfessed mortal sin faced eternal damnation. Murder was a mortal sin. Not a serious sin, not a sin that required significant penance. A mortal sin, one that, if unconfessed and unabsolved at the moment of death, condemned the soul to hell for eternity. Every assassin who took a life in the medieval period was aware, at some level, of this theological reality. Some managed to suppress it, operating under a logic of necessity or duty or political obligation that allowed them to compartmentalize the spiritual consequences. But the awareness was there, and it was corrosive. The assassin who lived long enough to grow old had to live with the weight of that sin, the constant possibility that he might die suddenly, in a street fight, from illness, in an accident, without the opportunity for confession and absolution. And the Church was not indifferent to the problem. Priests were not obligated to hear confession in cases where the confessor had no genuine intention of ceasing the sinful behavior. A hired killer who confessed to his murders but intended to continue his trade was not, in strict theological terms, eligible for absolution. He remained in a state of sin regardless of the confession. This created a profound spiritual trap. The professional assassin who took his faith seriously, and most medieval people, across all social classes, took their faith extremely seriously, could not simply confess his way out of the problem. He was caught in a theological loop from which the only escape was either genuine repentance and retirement from his profession, or the suppression of his spiritual conscience entirely. Neither option was comfortable. The first was economically disastrous, since he had no other skills or connections. The second required a degree of spiritual numbness that few people could genuinely achieve. The assassins of the Nizari Ismaili sect dealt with this spiritual burden in a different way. Their theological framework, developed by Hassan-I Sabbah and his successors, held that the killing of enemies of the Imam, the legitimate leader of the Shia community, was not merely permitted but was spiritually meritorious, a form of devotion that would be rewarded in the afterlife. The Fidai were not killing arbitrarily. They were executing a form of divine justice against men who were seen as oppressors and heretics. This theological reframing allowed the assassins to perform their acts without the spiritual dread that would have paralyzed a conventional medieval Christian in the same situation. It is, in its way, a tribute to human psychological ingenuity, and to the extent to which motivated people can reshape their moral frameworks to accommodate behaviors that would otherwise be intolerable. But it had its own costs. It required total submission to the will of the imam and the leadership of the sect. The fidai who killed on instructions could not question those instructions, could not doubt the spiritual framework that justified his actions, without the entire psychological structure collapsing. He was not an independent agent. He was a weapon in someone else's hand. The practical organization of medieval assassination was never as clean or as simple as the mythology suggests. To plan and execute a political killing required multiple people, someone to identify the target's routines and vulnerabilities, someone to provide funding, someone to execute the act itself, and often a network of helpers who could provide transport, shelter, false documents, and escape routes. Each additional person involved in the conspiracy was an additional point of failure. An additional person who might be captured, who might talk under torture, who might lose their nerve and go to the authorities, who might decide to sell the information to the target or a rival. The history of medieval assassination attempts is littered with failed plots that collapsed because someone in the network talked. The Puzzi conspiracy of 1478, an attempt to kill Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici in the Cathedral of Florence during High Mass, is one of the most extensively documented examples of a complex political assassination that partially succeeded and then collapsed catastrophically. The plot involved the Puzzi banking family, Pope Sixtus IV, the Archbishop of Pisa, mercenary captains, and foreign governments. It was meticulously planned over many months. When the moment came, the assassins killed Giuliano de' Medici, stabbing him 19 times in the cathedral, but failed to kill Lorenzo, who escaped with a wound. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Lorenzo's partisans seized and executed the conspirators, including the Archbishop of Pisa, who was hanged from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria still wearing his ecclesiastical vestments. The Puzzi family was stripped of its wealth and honors, its members imprisoned or killed. Pope Sixtus, whose involvement was an open secret, faced serious diplomatic consequences. Every member of the conspiracy who could be found was executed, often with conspicuous brutality. The lesson of the Puzzi conspiracy, and of dozens of similar cases throughout the medieval period, was clear: political assassination almost never remained a secret for long, the web of complicity inevitably became visible, and the punishment of conspirators was swift and comprehensive. For every successful assassination that destabilized a regime or changed the course of history, there were many more that failed on execution, or succeeded in the killing but failed in the political objective, or succeeded both in the killing and the political objective but destroyed every person who participated in the process. Let us return, for a moment, to the moment of the act itself, the physical reality of medieval close-quarters killing. The mythology of the assassin portrays the act as clean, swift, and professional. A blade to the throat. A dagger between the ribs. Death comes quickly and the killer slips away into the shadows. The reality was dramatically messier and more difficult. The human body is extraordinarily resistant to dying quickly, even when stabbed. Vital organs can be missed. Wounds that should be fatal can take minutes, agonizing minutes, to kill. A man who is stabbed and does not immediately die will very likely cry out, struggle, grab at his attacker, fall against furniture and objects that make noise, and generally create the kind of commotion that attracts immediate attention. Medieval weapons, despite being purpose-built for violence, did not always behave with the precision that their reputation suggests. A dagger thrust in haste or panic might strike a rib and deflect. A stroke aimed at the throat might miss the jugular. And open a wound that bleeds impressively but is not immediately fatal. Even trained fighters, in the heat of a real violent encounter rather than a controlled training exercise, experienced performance degradation, hands that shook, targeting that was off, the disorientation that came from adrenaline and fear. The assassin who had rehearsed the act in his mind dozens of times, who had studied the target's routine and planned every detail, might find in the actual moment of execution that his body did not cooperate with the plan. Armor complicated matters further. A lord or king, particularly in a formal or semi-formal setting, might be wearing at minimum a gambeson, a padded undergarment that could absorb a significant amount of force from a blade. And possibly mail or plate armor beneath ordinary-looking clothing. The assassination of a medieval ruler was not simply a matter of finding an unguarded moment and striking. It required knowing when the target was unarmored, which was typically in very private moments, sleeping, bathing, praying alone, that were precisely the moments when he was most carefully guarded and least accessible to strangers. The career of William Longespee, an English nobleman of the 13th century, provides an interesting case study in the atmosphere of paranoia that surrounded medieval political murder. Longespee died in 1226 after a period of illness, and contemporary accounts almost immediately raised the possibility of poisoning. A subsequent investigation, conducted with the limited forensic tools available to medieval physicians, could neither confirm nor rule out foul play. The uncertainty itself was politically significant. It meant that any number of his enemies could be suspected, that the atmosphere of mutual suspicion that the death generated lasted long after the body was buried, and that anyone who had been Longespee's enemy now lived under a cloud of potential accusation that could be deployed against them at any moment. Whether he was actually poisoned is something we cannot determine from the historical record. But the suspicion itself was a political weapon, and the fact that it arose so naturally tells us something important about how pervasive the fear of political murder was in medieval aristocratic society. The assassination of Henry the Lion's father, Henry the Black, Duke of Bavaria, in 1126 illustrates a different dimension of the problem. Henry the Black was not killed by an assassin in the conventional sense. He died after being imprisoned, and the circumstances of his death were sufficiently ambiguous to generate accusations of foul play. His jailers and the political enemies who had ordered his imprisonment found themselves under suspicion, investigations were launched, and the political consequences rippled outward for years. The lesson. In the medieval world, You did not even need to actually commission an assassination to find yourself suspected of one. Political deaths were always suspicious, always politically charged, and always generated a demand for accountability that could fall on innocent and guilty alike. The murder of King Edward II of England in 1327 is one of the most notorious and politically complex assassinations of the medieval period. Edward had been deposed by his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and then killed under circumstances that were immediately controversial and have remained so ever since. The official story was that he died of natural causes. Almost no one believed it. Rumor, and more than rumor, substantial contemporary evidence, suggested that he had been murdered on the instructions of Mortimer and possibly Isabella. The method of his alleged killing, which involved a red-hot poker, may or may not be historically accurate, but the political reality was clear. The people who had him killed needed him dead in a way that could not be directly attributed to them. They needed it to look like a natural death. And despite their best efforts, they failed to make it convincing. Within 3 years, Mortimer had been seized, tried, and executed for the murder of Edward II, among other crimes. Isabella was stripped of political power and spent the rest of her life in comfortable but politically marginalized retirement. The attempt to benefit from political murder while avoiding accountability for it had, as was so often the case, collapsed in the medium term. The Crusader states of the Holy Land offer a particularly vivid laboratory for understanding medieval assassination and its dynamics, because the political situation there was so extreme, so compressed, and so well documented by contemporary chroniclers who found the constant violence and intrigue irresistible narrative material. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa were small Christian states surrounded by far more powerful Muslim polities, constantly under military pressure, and internally riven by factional conflicts between noble families, religious orders, and competing claimants to power. In this environment, political murder was a common tool of statecraft, used by virtually every faction at various times and with varying degrees of success and failure. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, the great military orders of the Crusader period, were themselves implicated in political killing on multiple occasions. These were organizations of trained military men who operated with a degree of independence from the political authority of the Crusader kings, who had extensive intelligence networks throughout the region, and who had strategic interests that sometimes diverged sharply from those of the secular rulers. When a Crusader lord negotiated a peace treaty with a Muslim ruler that the Templars opposed, the Templars were not above taking violent action to derail those negotiations. The most dramatic example is the killing of the Muslim ambassador. Hassan Shah ibn Mullah Ib, who was traveling to negotiate with King Amalric I of Jerusalem, by Templar knights who feared the consequences of the proposed peace. The Templars killed him on the road, in open daylight, in defiance of the king's safe conduct guarantee. The political fallout was severe. Amalric arrested the Templar responsible for the killing and had him hanged. An extraordinary action against a member of a powerful religious military order that demonstrated how politically toxic the act of assassination could be even for those who had acted for what they believed were good strategic reasons. The Nizari Ismaili assassins of Syria, based at their great mountain fortress of Masyaf, interacted with the Crusader states in complex ways that defy simple characterization. They were sometimes enemies, sometimes neutral parties, sometimes de facto allies, depending on the political circumstances of the moment. Sinan ibn Salman, known as Rashid al-Din Sinan and to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain, led the Syrian branch of the sect for 3 decades in the late 12th century and became one of the most feared political figures in the region. His organization successfully killed the Crusader Lord Raymond II of Tripoli in 1152, making it the first documented Crusader victim of the assassins. But they also sent emissaries to negotiate with Crusader rulers, proposed at least one alliance with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and occasionally directed their killing operations against Muslim rulers rather than Christian ones when it suited their political calculations. Sinan himself is said to have been approached for the assassination of Saladin multiple times, and the 2 attempted killings that came closest to success both involved Fidai who had spent years establishing themselves in Saladin's circle. Both failed in the end. Saladin survived, and the experience left him permanently and understandably anxious about the security of his person. We must also consider the economic reality of the medieval assassin's existence, because it was, in almost every scenario, profoundly unfavorable. The men who carried out political killings in the medieval world were not generally well-compensated professionals who could accumulate wealth, retire comfortably, and live out their days in quiet obscurity. They were, more typically, either poor men who acted out of desperation or loyalty and received modest rewards if they survived, or men of somewhat higher standing who were acting under political compulsion and whose reward was continued favor from their patron, a commodity worth nothing if the patron subsequently decided to sacrifice them. The Fidai of the Nizari Ismaili sect received no financial compensation in the ordinary sense. They were members of a religious movement who acted out of ideological conviction, and their reward was spiritual rather than material. This model actually gave them a certain stability. They were not subject to the classic betrayal dynamic of the mercenary assassin who could always be outbid, but it imposed different costs. They were bound to the sect for life. They had no independent existence outside the organization. They could not decline a mission or negotiate its terms. They were instruments, not agents, and while the ideology that motivated them was genuine and deeply felt, the practical conditions of their lives were those of total dedication to an organization that controlled every aspect of their existence. For the hired killers of European medieval courts, men who accepted money or promises of reward to eliminate a political enemy, the economic reality was even worse. The payment, if it came at all, came only upon successful completion of the task. The assassin was therefore operating on speculation, advancing his own time, risk, and labor against a promised reward that he might never collect. If he was killed in the attempt, there was no payment and no compensation for his family. If he succeeded but the assassination became politically inconvenient, the patron had every incentive to deny the arrangement and leave the killer to face the consequences alone and unrewarded. If he succeeded and collected his payment, he was now a man with blood on his hands and money in his pocket, conspicuous, morally compromised, and in possession of knowledge that was dangerous to the patron. Some patrons, having used an assassin, found it convenient to ensure that the assassin was in no position to talk about what had been arranged. Medieval societies lacked forensic science in the modern sense, but they were not without methods of investigation, and the investigation of political murders was taken extremely seriously. When a great lord died under suspicious circumstances, the political and legal machinery of the medieval state swung into action with considerable energy. Witnesses were questioned, at length, under pressure, and sometimes under judicial torture. Household servants, guards, and visitors were detained and interrogated. The body of the deceased was examined by physicians for signs of violence or poison. Letters and documents in the dead man's chambers were searched for evidence of conspiracy. Informants were cultivated and questioned. The medieval world was also full of people who were very willing to denounce their neighbors for a variety of reasons. Genuine moral outrage, fear of being implicated themselves, hope of reward, personal grudges, or a combination of all of these. An assassin who thought he had acted in secret might find that someone had noticed him near the target's residence at the wrong time, or that a merchant had sold him a suspicious substance, or that a servant had overheard a conversation they were not supposed to hear. The medieval city was not a place of anonymity in the modern urban sense. In a city of tens of thousands, everyone in a particular neighborhood, a particular trade, a particular social circle, knew each other's business with extraordinary thoroughness. Keeping a secret in such an environment required a degree of social isolation and behavioral discipline that was genuinely very difficult to maintain over the long term. The Church added another layer of investigative pressure. The confessional was, in theory, absolutely secret. A priest who revealed what had been confessed to him faced severe canonical penalties. But the threat of eternal damnation for dying in an unconfessed state of mortal sin meant that assassins who took their faith seriously, and again, this was most medieval people, were under enormous psychological pressure to confess their acts. And confessors, while they could not break the seal of confession, could and did counsel penitents to go to the civil authorities, to make restitution, to seek absolution from the bishop or even the pope for particularly serious sins. The spiritual apparatus of medieval Christianity created a constant pressure toward disclosure that the purely secular structure of investigation did not, and it was a pressure that operated from inside the killer's own conscience. The history of medieval assassination is not entirely male, though female political killers were considerably rarer and faced their own additional layers of difficulty. Women in the medieval world were, in general, far more constrained in their physical freedom of movement than men. They were expected to be in specific places: the household, the convent, the household of a lord or lady, and their absence from those places was immediately noticeable. They were less likely to be trained in the use of weapons. They were less likely to have the independent agency and access to resources that planning and executing a political killing required. However, women in positions of power, queens, noblewomen, abbesses, had their own kinds of access that men did not. A queen had access to the king's bedchamber. A noblewoman had access to the food and drink served in the household. A female attendant had access to the intimate spaces of her mistress's private life. And the cultural assumption that women were not dangerous, that they were weaker, more passive, less capable of violence, could itself be a form of cover. The guards who were alert to a suspicious male stranger might be less suspicious of a familiar female face in a private setting. The most documented cases of female involvement in medieval political murder tend to involve poison rather than direct physical violence, reflecting both the available means and the cultural expectations of the time. Isabella of France, who was involved in the death of Edward II, is the most prominent example, though her exact role remains historically contested. Joanna of Naples was accused of complicity in the murder of her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, in 1345. He was strangled and thrown from a balcony, an act that was subsequently blamed on a conspiracy that may or may not have included the Queen. Joanna was never definitively proven guilty, but the accusation pursued her for decades, contributing to the political instability of her reign. The lesson here, as in the male cases, is consistent. Even if the killing succeeded, the consequences were almost impossible to control. For those rare individuals who survived the act of assassination, escaped immediate capture, and evaded the subsequent pursuit, the burden of survival was its own kind of torment. The medieval world had no witness protection program, no mechanism by which a political killer could simply disappear into a new identity in a distant city and live quietly ever after. The social networks that made detection possible before and immediately after an assassination continued to operate indefinitely afterward. A man who was suspected of killing a great lord might find himself unable to travel through the territory of that lord's family, which might be extremely large. He might find himself unable to practice his trade, his guild connections severed, his reputation poisoned. He might find himself the subject of ongoing investigations that never quite ended, that flared back to life every time a new piece of evidence emerged or a new political configuration made it convenient to pursue the old case. The blood feud could last for generations. In some regions and cultures of the medieval world, Ireland, Scotland, parts of Scandinavia, the mountain communities of the Balkans, the obligation to avenge a murdered kinsman was passed down from father to son to grandson. An old man who had killed in his youth might find the sons of his victim appearing at his door when he was too old to defend himself. This was not simply an abstract cultural norm. It was a lived reality that shaped the lives of anyone who had committed serious violence against a man of standing. Even the passage of time and the apparent success of escape did not necessarily bring peace. The spiritual weight accumulated over years of living with the knowledge of what had been done. The practical anxiety of never quite knowing whether the pursuit had truly ended. The social isolation that came from being a man with secrets too dangerous to share with anyone. The medieval assassin who survived his act did not retire to a comfortable old age. He lived in a state of chronic low-level dread that would be recognizable, in modern terms, as a combination of post-traumatic stress and rational paranoia. Perhaps the most corrosive aspect of the medieval assassin situation, the one that most thoroughly undermined the entire premise of his profession, was that political assassination almost never achieved its intended political goals. The murder of a political opponent did not typically eliminate the opposition. It merely removed one particular human being from the board while the forces that had placed that human being in opposition remained entirely intact. The ideology, the faction, the family, the cause, all of these survived the death of the individual, often with renewed vigor and an additional grievance to motivate them. When the Nizari Ismailis killed Nizam al-Mulk in 1092, they removed the most powerful political operator in the Seljuk Empire. The result was not the collapse of Seljuk power, as they had hoped. It was the fragmentation of Seljuk political authority into multiple competing successor factions, each of which had its own reasons to resent and persecute the Nizaris. The removal of the one man who had been strong enough to hold the empire together made the political situation for the Nizaris not better but worse, more chaotic, more unpredictable, more dangerous. The killing of Nizam al-Mulk was, by any strategic assessment, a failure that produced results contrary to the intentions of those who ordered it. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, technically beyond our medieval period but the culmination of a long tradition of political assassination, illustrates the same principle with catastrophic clarity. The killers wanted to destabilize Austro-Hungarian control of Bosnia and advance the cause of South Slav nationalism. What they got was the First World War and, eventually, a continent remade in ways that no one had intended and no one could have predicted. The gap between the intended political consequence of an assassination and its actual political consequence was, in the medieval period as in later centuries, almost invariably enormous. The assassin was a man who believed he could change history with a blade and discovered that history was rather more complicated than a single human life. As the medieval period approached its end, through the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, the technology of assassination and the technology of protection evolved together in a kind of arms race that increasingly favored the defender. The development of more sophisticated castle and palace architecture, the professionalization of bodyguard services, the increasing use of written bureaucracy that created paper trails and made conspiracies harder to organize without leaving evidence, the gradual development of something resembling proto-intelligence services at major courts. All of these trends made the work of the political assassin progressively harder and the consequences of failure progressively more comprehensive. The rise of gunpowder weapons added new complications. A crossbow bolt or a pistol shot, even the primitive firearms of the 15th century, could kill from a distance, potentially allowing an assassin to strike and escape in a way that was impossible with a close-quarters weapon. But firearms of this period were notoriously unreliable, loud, slow to reload, and distinctive. The sound of a gunshot in a quiet courtyard immediately identified the direction of the shot and drew every armed man in the vicinity to that location. The assassin with a crossbow or early firearm gained some theoretical distance advantage at the cost of the speed and intimacy of escape that the knife had offered. The development of poison detection also advanced, particularly in the Italian city-states of the 14th and 15th centuries, where political poisoning was both more common and more systematically feared than almost anywhere else in Europe. The Visconti of Milan, the Sforza, the Medici. These dynasties all operated in a political culture where assassination was an ever-present threat and where significant resources were devoted to developing detection methods, antidotes, and general prophylactic measures. The elaborate food-tasting rituals of the Italian courts became genuine science, or as close to science as the period allowed, rather than mere ceremony. We have spoken much about the physical and political dangers of medieval assassination, but we have not fully reckoned with the psychological dimension, the interior life of the man who had decided to kill, or had been chosen to kill, or had been coerced into killing. The psychological profile of the medieval political assassin varied enormously depending on the circumstances that had produced him. Some were fanatical ideologues, like the Fidei, who had been systematically conditioned over years to see killing as sacred duty. Some were mercenaries, men of the professional violence class for whom killing was simply work and who had developed the emotional compartmentalization that allowed them to perform it without lasting psychological disturbance, or at least without disturbance that incapacitated them professionally. Some were ordinary people. Servants, minor courtiers, household officers, who had been drawn into a conspiracy by a combination of loyalty, debt, fear, or manipulation and who had committed an act of violence that was far outside their normal behavioral range. This last category, the reluctant assassin, the man who killed once under pressure and then had to live with the consequences, is perhaps the most historically poignant. We know from surviving legal records, chronicles, and occasional personal testimony that medieval people caught up in political violence often expressed profound regret, psychological disturbance, and lasting guilt. The Church's framework of sin, confession, and penance was not simply a bureaucratic system. It reflected a genuine understanding of the psychological reality that violent acts left lasting marks on those who committed them, that the soul of the killer was damaged by the act of killing, and that some kind of moral reckoning was necessary for psychological as well as spiritual health. Men who had participated in political murders sought absolution with an urgency that suggests genuine psychological distress rather than mere formality. Some went on pilgrimage to Rome or Jerusalem as acts of penance. Some founded monasteries or hospitals as acts of spiritual compensation. Some spent their remaining years in conspicuous acts of charity that look, in retrospect, like the behavior of men trying to wash away a stain they knew would never fully come clean. The medieval assassin was not, in most cases, a sociopath for whom killing meant nothing. He was a human being who had done something that his deepest instincts, his religious conditioning, and his social values told him was wrong, and he had to find some way to keep living with that knowledge. The mythology that has grown up around medieval assassins, particularly the Nizari Ismaili assassins, tells us as much about the fears and fantasies of the people who constructed it as it does about the historical reality. The European crusaders who encountered the Fidai in Syria and Palestine were deeply impressed and deeply frightened by them. The idea of an army of silent, fanatical killers who could penetrate any security, who feared neither death nor pain, who were entirely devoted to a remote and mysterious master, spoke to the deepest anxieties of men who lived in constant fear of political violence. The legend of the assassins, elaborated by Marco Polo and dozens of other writers, embellished with stories of secret gardens of paradise shown to recruits to convince them of the pleasures awaiting them in the afterlife, grew to be far larger and more dramatic than the historical reality. This myth-making served multiple purposes for the European audiences who consumed it. It explained why powerful men could be killed despite elaborate security. It transferred the capacity for assassination onto a conveniently exotic and religiously alien other, not Christian Europeans killing each other, as was in fact happening constantly, but mysterious Eastern fanatics. It added a layer of supernatural drama to what was, in reality, a straightforward if extremely risky intelligence gathering and killing operation. And it made the assassin a figure of terror that was simultaneously irresistible as a story. The reality, as we have seen, was rather more mundane and rather more miserable. The Fidai were young men from ordinary backgrounds who had been recruited, trained, and deployed by a religious political organization operating under extreme existential pressure. They were brave, certainly, extraordinarily brave, in the sense of being willing to undertake missions with very low probability of survival. They were skilled and dedicated. But they were also human beings who spent years living in isolation and fear, who faced torture and death as likely outcomes of their missions, who were instruments of a political strategy that ultimately failed. The Nizari Ismaili mountain fortresses were eventually overrun and destroyed by the Mongol invasions of the mid-13th century, and the community was scattered and decimated. The great edifice of assassination that Hassan I Sabbah had built over a century of patient effort was ultimately unable to prevent the catastrophe that Mongol conquest brought to the entire Eastern Islamic world. And so we return, at last, to the question with which we began. Why did it suck to be a medieval assassin? The answer, by now, should be abundantly clear, but it is worth stating it plainly, because the accumulated weight of the evidence reveals something important not just about assassination but about the nature of political violence in general. It sucked because the technical challenges were enormous and the margin for error was essentially zero. It sucked because the consequences of failure, capture, torture, public execution in ways designed to maximize suffering and humiliation, were among the worst that any society has ever devised. It sucked because even success offered no real safety, since success simply transferred the danger from the act itself to the aftermath, which was characterized by relentless pursuit, political abandonment by patrons, and the permanent, unshakable awareness of living as a marked man. It sucked because the spiritual dimension added a layer of anguish that was, for most medieval people, genuinely real and genuinely terrifying, the knowledge that the soul was in mortal jeopardy, that eternal damnation was the price of an unabsolved mortal sin, that the professional killer had placed himself in a theological situation from which there was no easy escape. It sucked because the political
effectiveness of assassination was, in the historical record, negligible. The deaths it produced rarely achieved the intended political goals, and often made things worse, while reliably destroying the lives of those who had carried them out. And it sucked, perhaps most fundamentally, because the assassin was almost never a free agent acting on his own behalf and in his own interests. He was almost always an instrument of a religious sect, of a noble patron, of a political faction, whose needs and interests were not his own, and whose willingness to sacrifice him when convenient was an ever-present reality that he could ignore only at his own considerable peril. The medieval assassin was a man who had placed himself in the service of forces larger than himself, using methods that put him at the extreme of human risk, for goals that were rarely his own, and for rewards that were rarely commensurate with what he had hazarded. The mythology tells us about shadows and daggers and silent death. The history tells us about frightened men in difficult circumstances making desperate choices and paying enormous prices. Between the myth and the reality lies the true story of medieval assassination, not glamorous, not romantic, not particularly effective as a political tool, but absolutely revealing of the violence, the fear, the spiritual anxiety, and the ruthless political calculation that lay at the heart of the medieval world. The shadows in the corridors were real, the daggers were real, the deaths were real, but the assassin who moved through those shadows was not a ghost or a demon or a superhuman agent of fate. He was a man, frightened, mortal, spiritually tormented, politically exploited, and almost certainly heading toward an end that would be, by any measure, extraordinarily unpleasant. He was, in every sense that mattered, a man doing a terrible job in terrible conditions for terrible reasons, with terrible outcomes. And if there is a lesson in his story, beyond the obvious practical one about the inadvisability of a career in medieval political murder, it is perhaps this, that political violence is never as clean as its architects imagine, never as controllable as its instruments believe, and never as effective as its patrons hope. The blade always cuts in more directions than the hand that wields it intends.